your hair straight whenever you go shoot someplace up, you know? Gotta look fabulous, you know? Just gotta look fabulous.
On September 28, 2016, in Townville, South Carolina, a 14-year-old killed his father at home. Then he got in a truck and drove about 2 miles to an elementary school. He didn't walk into the building. He didn't need to. Recess was happening outside, and in minutes, a playground became a shooting scene. Jesse Osborne was 14 years old, an age where most kids are worried about homework, video games, and whether they're going to get grounded. But people who knew him described a kid who was drifting into something darker. He was isolated, angry, obsessed with violent content. Not the kind of anger that burns out after a week, the kind that sits and grows. And before that day, there were signs this wasn't just teenage mood. Prosecutors later described online messages and searches that pointed to planning. He'd looked into other school shootings. He'd saved images tied to past mass killings. He had messages where he talked about kill counts like it was a scoreboard. The point wasn't that he was curious, it was that he was rehearsing the idea in his mind before he ever moved. On the morning of September 28th, that rehearsal became real. At his home, Jesse shot and killed his father, Jeffrey Osborne. No intruder, no struggle with a stranger, a father murdered by his own son inside their house. Then he took the vehicle and drove to Townville Elementary School. It's a small place. The distance from his house to the school was roughly 2 miles, a short drive that gave him time to turn back, to reconsider, to stop. Instead, it became the calm between 2 acts of violence. When he arrived, he crashed the truck into a fence near the schoolyard. Children were outside. Teachers were outside. There was no locked door between them and him. Because the attack wasn't in the building, it was right there on the grounds. Jesse pulled out a handgun and opened fire toward the playground area. 6-year-old Jacob Hall was shot. He later died. 2 other children were shot and injured. A teacher was also injured while trying to protect students. The entire attack unfolded fast, and it ended fast. Not because Jesse ran out of intention, but because someone stopped him. Volunteer firefighter Jamie Brock confronted him and tackled him, pinning him down until police arrived. Officers were on scene within minutes of the 9/11 call. In a situation that could have spiraled into a far higher body count, the violence was cut off by direct intervention. After he was arrested, reporting describes Jesse confessing to police. So the case wasn't built on rumors or theories, it was built on a straightforward sequence. A father killed at home, then an elementary school attack outside during recess. The community reaction was immediate shock. Townville is not a city where people expect this kind of horror. Parents flooded the area. Teachers held crying children. A school that normally meant safety became a place families couldn't stop picturing. And then came the legal problem. How do you sentence a 14-year-old for something like this? South Carolina prosecutors pushed to try him as an adult. The courts agreed. That decision alone signaled how the state viewed the crime, not as juvenile delinquency, but as a level of violence that demanded adult consequences. On December 12, 2018, Jesse Osborne entered guilty pleas. He pleaded guilty in adult court, rather than forcing a trial where victims' families and wounded children would have to relive everything in detail. But the sentencing phase still became its own emotional war. In November 2019, he was sentenced to life without parole for the murder, plus 30 years for attempted murder. He was the judge's statement to the courtroom. No parole board, no review in 25 or 30 years. For years, that was the official outcome, a 14-year-old locked into dying in prison. But the story did not stop there. His case became a testbed for the national legal argument around juvenile sentencing. The idea that even offenders who commit monstrous crimes as children must have some meaningful opportunity for release in the future. Hearings followed. Motions were filed. The courts had to wrestle with whether life without parole for someone who was 14 at the time of the crime could stand under evolving standards. Eventually, the sentence changed. In 2023, reporting described his punishment being modified to 75-year sentences. And the current South Carolina Department of Corrections requests that the active murder sentence is listed as 75 years, with parole eligibility shown as not eligible. 75 years is not a second chance. It's a technical adjustment that still seals the door. A 14-year-old who committed this crime in 2016 would be an old man at the end of 75 years. For Townville, the tragedy will always be Jacob Hall, a first grader who went to recess and never came home. For the justice system, the case became a brutal collision between childhood and irreversible violence. And for Jesse Osborne, it became the day he ensured he will spend the rest of his life behind prison walls.
I'm not the one. I hope they find justice, man, and I hope they find the answer they're looking for, but I'm not the one.
On January 6, 2010, inside a small neighborhood grocery store in Minneapolis' Seaward community, a robbery turned into a massacre. 3 men were shot and killed inside Seaward Market and Halal Meat. The gunman was 17 years old. Mahd Hassan Ali was not a stranger passing through Minneapolis. He was part of the local Somali community, young, quiet. Not some national headline name at the time, just another teenager in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other. But on that winter afternoon, something escalated beyond control. According to trial evidence, Ali entered the Seward Market during what prosecutors described as an attempted robbery. What was supposed to be theft turned into 3 executions inside a confined space. When it was over, Osman Jamar Elmi, 28, Muhammad Abdi Warfa, 30, and Anwar Salah Mohammed, 31, were dead. All 3 were working inside the store. All 3 were unarmed. Security cameras inside the market captured the attack. The footage became central at trial. It showed how quickly everything unfolded. No prolonged standoff, no dramatic negotiation, just a few violent moments that permanently destroyed 3 families. Police moved quickly. Ali was arrested shortly after the shootings. The case advanced fast, and the community watched every development closely. Seward is tight-knit. These weren't anonymous victims. These were men known in the neighborhood. The trial in 2011 lasted roughly 2 weeks. Jurors heard testimony about the attempted robbery, the gunfire inside the store, and the deaths of the 3 victims. Ali was found guilty of multiple counts tied to the killings, including first-degree murder charges. But the case did not end with the verdict. It evolved into something much larger. Because Mahdi Hassan Ali was a juvenile at the time of the crime, he was 17, and in the years around his conviction, the United States Supreme Court had become reshaping how courts sentenced juveniles. Mandatory life without parole for minors was being struck down. Courts were increasingly emphasizing that children are constitutionally different from adults when it comes to sentencing. Ali's case collided directly with that national debate. The district court imposed 3 consecutive life sentences. Each life term carried the possibility of release after 30 years. But because they were ordered consecutively, not concurrently, Ali would have to serve them one after another. 30 years, then another 30, then another 30, at least 90 years before he could even be considered for release. The defense argued that this structure was effectively a life without parole sentence in disguise. 90 years before eligibility means a teenager would almost certainly die in prison. They challenged the sentence as unconstitutional, arguing it was cruel and unusual punishment for a juvenile. The case went all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court. In 2016, the Minnesota Supreme Court upheld the consecutive life sentences. The court rejected the argument that stacking 3 life terms violated the 8th Amendment. It concluded that because each sentence technically allowed for release after 30 years, the structure did not amount to mandatory life without parole under existing precedent. In other words, legally permissible. Ali continued appealing. In federal court, the federal courts ultimately denied relief. One of the most unusual arguments raised in his appeals involved his age. His defense questioned documentation surrounding his birth date, arguing that records issues could mean he was younger than believed at the time of the crime. Courts ultimately concluded that he was at least 16 at the time of the offense, rejecting the claim that he was too young to face the sentence imposed. Another wrinkle surfaced years later when an accomplice reportedly claimed he had lied during earlier proceedings. That allegation gained media attention, but the conviction itself remained in place. Through all of it, one fact never changed. 3 men were killed during an attempted robbery inside a neighborhood store, and the person convicted of pulling the trigger was 17. Mahdi Hassan Ali committed 3 killings at 17 years old. The courts answered with 3 stacked life sentences. And under that structure, freedom sits at least 90 years away. On the morning of February 19th, 1997, students were filing into Bethel Regional High School in Bethel, Alaska, just before classes began. Within minutes, the building would turn into a crime scene. Evan Ramsey was 16 years old. He didn't grow up in a stable home. His early childhood was marked by neglect and instability. His parents struggled with addiction. He moved between relatives and foster placements. By the time he was a teenager, in Bethel, a remote Alaskan community accessible only by plane or river, Ramsey had built a reputation as angry, isolated, and unpredictable. But this wasn't a silent spiral. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, Ramsey talked. He told classmates he was planning to bring a gun to school. He said he couldn't hold his anger in anymore. According to later reporting, he even asked one friend for a firearm and asked another for advice on how to carry out the attack. 2 weeks before the shooting, he drew up what was described as a hit list. At least one teenager, identified in court records as JR, taught him how to use a 12-gauge shotgun. Testimony later showed JR encouraged him to go through with it and even urged others not to interfere. These weren't whispers, they were warnings. Some students thought he was joking, others didn't believe he would actually do it. The idea that a 16-year-old would bring a shotgun into school felt unreal, until it wasn't. On February 19th, just before first period, Ramsey walked into Bethel Regional High School, carrying a 12-gauge shotgun. He opened fire. Principal Ron Edwards was shot and killed. Edwards was known in the community as someone who tried to work with troubled students, including Ramsey. Student Josh Palacios, also 16 years old, was shot and killed. The episode lasted roughly 15 minutes. There was chaos, confusion, students running for cover. After a short standoff inside the building, Ramsey surrendered and was taken into custody. 2 people were dead. The shooter was a teenager who had openly talked about doing it. In the aftermath, Ramsey gave interviews that stunned people even further. In one televised interview, he said he believed the victims might get back up after being shot. He claimed he did not fully grasp that they would die. He also described intense anger and difficulty coping with teasing at school. Some reporting framed the attack as partly driven by bullying and humiliation. Other coverage suggested the shooting may have been a form of suicide mission, that he expected to die during the incident. But regardless of motive, 2 lives were gone. The legal process that followed became complex. Ramsey was charged as an adult. In 1998, he was sentenced to 210 years in prison. The structure reflected consecutive terms tied to the killings and additional counts. However, the appeals process reshaped part of the case. The Alaska Court of Appeals reversed one of his convictions, an attempted murder count. That reversal triggered resentencing. In June 2004, Ramsey was resentenced to 198 years in prison. Under Alaska law, he must serve 66 years before becoming eligible for parole. He was 16 when he committed the crime. That means he would have to spend more than 6 decades behind bars before he can even ask for release. One of the most controversial parts of the case involved JR, the teenager who had allegedly encouraged Ramsey and taught him how to use the shotgun. JR was initially convicted for his role in the events, but the Alaska Court of Appeals later reversed his convictions. That reversal fueled debate of how much responsibility lies with someone who encourages violence but does not pull the trigger. Ramsey, however, was the one who walked into the school with the weapon. The existence of a hit list, the discussions with friends, the training on how to fire the shotgun, it all painted a picture of preparation, not a spontaneous outburst. At sentencing and during appeals, Ramsey's youth was acknowledged. But the court ultimately concluded that the gravity of bringing a loaded shotgun into a school and killing 2 people outweighed arguments for leniency. For the families of Ron Edwards and Josh Palacios, those decades do not change the outcome. A principal who tried to help students, a teenager who went to school and never came home. Ramsey has spent nearly his entire adult life behind bars. The sentence, restructured to 198 years with a 66-year minimum before parole eligibility, ensures that even if he survives into old age, freedom is far from guaranteed. On a late summer night in 1993, a 17-year-old in suburban Missouri told his friends something chilling. He said they were going to break into a house, tie someone up, throw them off a bridge, and he laughed that because he was under 18, he could get away with it. Christopher Simmons wasn't whispering this in paranoia. He was boasting. He wanted to prove something, not just that he could kill, but that the system wouldn't be able to touch him. At the time, Simmons was a high school student in Fenton, Missouri. He wasn't some shadowy outsider. He had friends. He had a routine. But those who later testified described the teenager who talked about violence casually, almost experimentally, as if it were a challenge he wanted to complete. In the days before September 9th, he brought up the idea repeatedly. He recruited 2 younger friends, 15-year-old Charles Benjamin and another teenager, John Tesmer. The plan wasn't vague. It was specific. Break in, find the victim, throw them off a bridge. In the early morning hours, around 2 a.m., the 3 met up. Tesmer backed out before it began. Benjamin stayed. Simmons chose the house of Shirley Crook, a 46-year-old woman he recognized from a minor car accident months earlier. That recognition mattered. He knew she had seen him before. He knew she could identify him. Instead of deterring him, that knowledge hardened his decision. They went to her home in the middle of the night. They reached through an open window and unlocked the back door. They entered quietly while she was asleep. Inside her bedroom, they restrained her with duct tape and electrical wire. They covered her face. They wrapped her in a blanket. They carried her to her own minivan. Then they drove to Castlewood State Park. The railroad trestle bridge over the Merrimack River stands high above the water. It's not a symbolic place. It's a real drop. At the bridge, Simmons tightened the bindings. Then he threw her off. Shirley Crook drowned in the river below. Afterward, Simmons didn't disappear into hiding. Later that same day, he was overheard talking about what he had done. He told people he had killed a woman. The murder, to him, was something to recount. The next day, police arrested him at his high school after receiving a tip. At first, he denied involvement. Then he waived his rights. He confessed. Not only did he confess, he agreed to a videotaped reenactment at the park. On camera, he walked investigators through how they entered the home, how they bound Crook, how they drove her to the bridge, how they pushed her over. That recording became central at trial. Charles Benjamin was also charged and later received life without parole for his role. John Tesmer, who had backed out, was initially charged with conspiracy, but the charge was dropped in exchange for his testimony. The trial focused on intent and planning. This wasn't a fight that escalated. It wasn't a robbery that went wrong. It was a premeditated killing, discussed in advance. The jury convicted Simmons of first-degree murder. They recommended the death penalty. The judge imposed it. In 1997, the Missouri Supreme Court affirmed both his conviction and his death sentence on direct appeal. Christopher Simmons was 17 at the time of the crime. He was now sitting on death row. At that point in American law, executing 16 and 17-year-olds was still permitted. Several states allowed it. Missouri was one of them. But the legal ground beneath him began to shift. As the years passed, courts across the country wrestled with how to treat juvenile offenders. In 2003, the Missouri Supreme Court revisited Simmons' death sentence in light of evolving standards. The court set it aside, concluding that executing someone for a crime committed under 18 violated the Eighth Amendment. The case then moved to the United States Supreme Court. In 2005, in a 5-4 decision, the court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that the execution of offenders who were under 18 at the time of their crimes is unconstitutional. The ruling ended the juvenile death penalty nationwide. It did not question what Simmons had done. It did not overturn his conviction. It eliminated his death sentence. His punishment became life imprisonment without eligibility for parole. But strip away the legal theory, and the story is still grounded in a simple sequence of events. A teenager who bragged he could get away with murder because of his age. A woman bound in her own bedroom. A drive to a bridge in the middle of the night. A fall into the Merrimack River. A videotaped confession. A death sentence. Then, a historic Supreme Court ruling. The teenager who believed being under 18 made him untouchable ended up changing the Constitution, and he will spend the rest of his life in prison because of what he did on that September night in 1993.
Saying pull the trigger, the killer's done. No, man, it's not right.
On February 27, 2012, a 17-year-old walked into Chardon High School in Ohio with a .22 caliber Ruger pistol and a decision already made. In less than a minute, he would turn a normal school morning into a permanent tragedy. And a year later, he would walk into court wearing a shirt that said one word, a word aimed directly at the families in the room: killer. Thomas Michael T.J. Lane III wasn't some mysterious figure who appeared out of nowhere. He was a teenager from Northeast Ohio who had bounced through instability, a kid people described as quiet and withdrawn, sometimes awkward, sometimes simmering, not a popular athlete, not the loud class clown, more like someone who lived on the edge of the room, physically and emotionally. That kind of kid exists in every school. Most of them never hurt anyone. Lane did. And what makes this case so unsettling is that even after the shooting, the why never landed in a clean, satisfying box. It wasn't a manifesto-driven ideological attack. It wasn't a single obvious personal feud that made people go, oh, that's what this was. Instead, the picture that emerged was colder. A teenager who decided to kill and then pick targets without a reason anyone could point to and understand. That morning at Chardon High, students were in the cafeteria area before classes fully began. It was the kind of ordinary moment no one remembers until it becomes the last before photo in their mind. Lane approached a group of students sitting together. Then he raised the handgun and opened fire. 6 students were shot, 3 died. Daniel Parmator, 16, was killed. Demetrius Hewlin, 16, was killed. Russell King Jr., 17, was shot and later died from his injuries. 3 more students were wounded and survived, carrying the injuries and the memory for the rest of their lives. The shooting itself was fast, which is part of what makes it so horrifying. There was no time to process what was happening. It was just sudden violence in a place that isn't supposed to have it. Then Lane fled the school. He was arrested shortly after he ran, and once he was in custody, the case moved from chaos to clarity. Not because the motive became clear, but because the facts did. Authorities later said Lane confessed, and according to the prosecutor's description of what Lane told investigators, he didn't know the victims personally and chose them at random. That single detail changed the emotional temperature of the whole case. Because if it's random, and every student in that cafeteria becomes the could have been, it turns grief into something wider. In the months that followed, Lane's case took the path that always stuns people when they see how young he was. He was prosecuted as an adult. Ohio has mandatory bind-over rules for certain violent offenses, meaning a juvenile can be transferred into adult court based on the charges and circumstances. Lane later challenged aspects of that process on appeal, arguing about how the system treated him as a juvenile, moved into adult punishment. But the prosecution's direction was clear from the start. This wasn't going to be juvenile detention. This was going to be prison for life. In 2013, Lane pleaded guilty. There was no trial, or a courtroom would spend weeks replaying the school's worst day. He admitted responsibility to 3 counts of aggravated murder and additional counts connected to the wounded students. But even with a guilty plea, Lane still found a way to make the moment about cruelty. Sentencing day became one of the most infamous courtroom scenes in modern American crime coverage. Families were there, survivors were there, people were preparing themselves to speak about children they would never see again, about empty bedrooms, about birthdays that would never be celebrated. And Lane treated it like theater. He taunted the room, he made obscene gestures, he disrupted the proceedings so aggressively that the judge ordered him removed from the courtroom. And then came the image that stuck to the case like a brand. Under his shirt, he revealed another shirt that read, "Killer." The judge was immoved by it. If anything, it hardened the tone. Lane was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 37 years for the other charges. That number matters because it shows how the court treated this, but as stacked, separate consequences, reinforced with decades on top. 3 life without parole terms, consecutive, means no parole board, no future hearing where time and good behavior magically turn this into a second chance. And even if someone wants to argue about technicalities decades from now, there's still the extra 37 years, sitting on top like a steel door bolted shut. The judge's reasoning was blunt. The court did not see remorse, did not see a motive that reduced danger, and did not see a future where society could risk this person ever walking free. If the shooting made Lane infamous, prison proved he wasn't done becoming a problem. On September 11th, 2014, Lane escaped from the Allen Correctional Complex along with 2 other inmates. For a moment, the public got the nightmare version of this story. The school shooter is out. He wasn't free for hours. He was on the run overnight. After an all-night search, Lane was captured the next morning, September 12th, near the area of the prison, reported outside a church. The escape didn't change his sentence. It didn't create a new chapter where he slips away into a different life. It just reinforced the image of someone who would not stop disrupting and destroying wherever he was placed. Since then, Lane has remained incarcerated in Ohio, serving exactly what the courtroom promised. But the core outcome has not changed. The Chardon High School shooting remains one of Ohio's deepest scars, not because it was the largest shooting in history, but because it was intimate. A cafeteria, students who were just sitting there, a killer who later admitted the victims were random. It forces the truth. Sometimes the reason is simply that someone wanted to kill. And the final image, the one that still makes people angry years later, isn't just the gun. It's a teenager in court, mocking grief, wearing a shirt that tried to reduce 3 dead kids to a trophy word. The judge answered with a sentence that matched the message, "You will never leave prison." On April 10th, 2019, in Boone, North Carolina, a 17-year-old reached the point of no return, inside their home where his parents thought they were still raising a kid. By the end of that day, Tanya Mae Borlace and Jeffrey David Borlace were dead. And their son, Tristan Noah Borlace, was the reason. Boone is the kind of place where family home usually means safety. It's a college town tucked into the mountains, a community where people recognize each other at grocery stores, where neighbors notice when something feels off. The Borlaces weren't public celebrities. They weren't living some notorious double life. They were parents trying to keep their teenager on track. And that's where this story really begins. Not with the violence, but with pressure. Because what pushed Tristan over the edge wasn't a gang feud, or a robbery, or a random break. It was something painfully normal. School. That day, Tristan's parents confronted him over a bad school report, the kind that raises alarms about whether a student is even going to graduate. His parents punished him for it. They were trying to course correct, to discipline, to force reality to sink in. For most families, that moment ends with slammed doors and resentment. In this house, it ended with 2 funerals. Tristan wasn't 25. He wasn't 30. He was 17, old enough to understand consequences, young enough for people to instinctively search for some explanation that makes it make sense. But the timeline doesn't leave room for a complicated mystery. On April 10th, inside the Borlace home, Tanya was killed first. The evidence and later court reporting describe a combination of methods. She was stabbed, strangled, and struck. Then Jeffrey was attacked. He was stabbed multiple times. 2 parents killed in and around their own home on a day that began with the punishment of a school. And then came the part that separates a sudden rage from a person trying to escape what they've done. After the killings, Tristan didn't simply collapse and call for help. He attempted to cover it up. That detail is a big reason the case didn't stay in the lane of teen snapped. It became teen acted and then tried to manage the aftermath. The investigation that followed was extensive and evidence heavy. The scene itself contained massive amounts of blood evidence, the kind that turns a home into a forensic project. Search warrants multiplied. Phones were pulled into the case. Investigators didn't just look at what happened in the house. They examined what happened after, what was communicated, what steps were taken, what devices could show intent, planning, or cleanup. This wasn't treated like a juvenile mistake. It was treated like a double homicide, with a living suspect who tried to outmaneuver the consequences. When the case went to trial, the core question wasn't who did it, it was how the court should sentence someone who did this at 17. Because by the time Borlase faced the jury, the United States had already changed the rules around juvenile punishment. Courts can't just throw life without parole onto every teenager convicted of murder the way they once could. The sentencing process requires deeper findings. It's supposed to be reserved for the rare juvenile offender, the kind the court believes is permanently beyond rehabilitation. That's the legal cliff edge in this case. In 2022, a jury found Tristan Noah Borlase guilty for the murders of Tanya and Jeffrey Borlase. Then came sentencing. The judge considered mitigating factors, not as a formality, but as part of the constitutional requirement in modern juvenile sentencing: age, development, potential for rehabilitation, the realities of a teenager's brain and impulse control, the argument that youth should still matter, even when the crime is monstrous. And after weighing all of it, the court still imposed the harshest outcome: 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, back to back. Not one life sentence covering 2 deaths. 2 permanent punishments, stacked. 1 for Tanya, 1 for Jeffrey. And it all traces back to a moment that sounds almost insulting in how ordinary it is. A bad school report, a punishment, a teenager feeling cornered, then the violence, then the courtroom question that hung over the entire case: is this the kind of teenager who could ever come back from what he did? The judge's answer was no. On January 17, 2020, in Grantsville, Utah, a 16-year-old made a decision that would wipe out nearly his entire family in a single afternoon. By the end of that day, 4 people were dead, and one more, his father, had survived after being shot and wresting the gun away from his own son. Colin Jeffrey Haney, known as CJ, wasn't living some hidden double life. He was a sophomore in high school. He had no prior criminal record. He lived in a quiet community where violent crime is rare and neighbors tend to trust each other. Inside his home that day were his mother, Consuelo Alejandra Haney, and his siblings, Alexis, 15, Matthew, 14, and the youngest, Milan, 12. His father was at work. The killings didn't happen in one chaotic burst. They happened over hours. CJ had skipped school that day. One by one, as family members returned home, he shot them with a handgun. His mother was killed, then his siblings. The final confrontation came when his father arrived home later that evening. Instead of walking into silence, he walked into gunfire. CJ shot him too, but his father survived. In a struggle that likely decided whether there would be a 5th funeral, his father wrestled the gun away from him and held him until police arrived. That detail changes everything about the case. This wasn't discovered days later. It wasn't a secret sitting behind closed doors. It ended because one victim fought back. 4 dead, 1 wounded survivor who had to live with what he had just stopped and what he had just lost. As investigators pieced together what led to the killings, prosecutors described something even more disturbing than rage. They described planning. According to statements presented in court and in a pre-sentence report, CJ told authorities he intended to kill his entire family and then burn the house down to start over, to create what he described as a clean slate or a new opportunity. He reportedly said that if he killed only his father, the rest of the family would turn against him, so he chose to eliminate all of them. That wasn't a heat-of-the-moment explanation. That was calculated logic. Defense attorneys later emphasized that he was a teenager, struggling with anxiety and emotional issues. They pointed to bullying and stress. They reminded the court that he had no prior criminal history. But the prosecution emphasized the methodical nature of the crime, that he skipped school, waited for family members to come home, and shot them as they arrived, that it unfolded across hours, not seconds. On July 19, 2022, CJ Haney pleaded guilty to 4 counts of aggravated murder and 1 count of attempted aggravated murder for shooting his father. There was no drawn-out trial. He stood in court and admitted what he had done. At sentencing, he addressed the court and apologized. But apologies don't resurrect parents. They don't bring back siblings. They don't undo a day structured around killing the people who trusted you most. In 2023, the judge imposed 4 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life for the murders. That means each murder carries a minimum of 25 years before parole eligibility, and because they run consecutively, you must serve them one after the other. 25 years, then another 25, then another, then another. At least 100 years before he could even be considered for release. The attempted murder sentence for shooting his father was ordered to run concurrently, not consecutively. But the 4 murder counts were stacked deliberately. The judge chose the maximum structure available under the law. The result, effectively, a life sentence. The case shocked Grantsville because it didn't fit into any familiar box. This wasn't gang retaliation. It wasn't a robbery. It was a family annihilation carried out by a 16-year-old inside his own home. And the detail that continues to stand out is the father's survival. He came home expecting a normal evening. He was shot by his son. He fought back. He stopped it. Then he had to sit in court and listen to the sentencing of the child who killed his wife and 3 children. This case forces an uncomfortable reality. The courts considered youth. They considered anxiety. They considered rehabilitation. They considered the science of adolescent development. And they still imposed 4 consecutive 25 to life sentences because the court concluded that what happened on January 17, 2020 wasn't an impulsive mistake. It was a day structured around killing an entire family. On July 29, 2024, in Southport, England, a children's dance workshop turned into one of the most horrifying crime scenes the United Kingdom had seen in years. The attacker was 17. Axel Rudakubana did not storm a battlefield. He walked into a Taylor Swift-themed summer dance class filled with young girls. By the time it was over, 3 children were dead. 10 more people, 8 children and 2 adults, were victims of attempted murder. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was planned. 2 weeks before the attack, on July 13, 2024, Rudakubana bought a large kitchen knife online. That purchase would later become one of the clearest indicators of preparation. This was not grabbing something in anger. It was acquisition. And that wasn't the only warning sign in his history. When he was just 13 years old, he had already been convicted of possessing a knife on school premises. A child caught with a weapon, a moment that, in hindsight, feels like an early alarm bell. By 17, those alarms had turned into something much darker. When police later searched his devices, they found material showing a long-standing preoccupation with violent killing. Among the files were copies of an Al-Qaeda training manual, including sections dealing with knife attacks. The investigation also uncovered ricin-related material, leading to additional charges beyond the stabbings themselves. This case was not prosecuted as terrorism for motive, but the presence of extremist manuals and chemical materials added another layer to what the court was dealing with. On July 29th, he entered the dance studio, armed with that knife. Inside were children between 6 and 11 years old. He attacked. 3 girls died. 10 others, 8 children and 2 adults who intervened, were victims of attempted murder. The scale of it mattered legally. This was not a single fatal assault. It was a mass attack on minors, carried out in a space designed for joy. Police arrested him at the scene. There was no long chase, no mystery about the identity of the attacker. And then came the next shock. He pleaded guilty. There was no drawn-out trial with weeks of testimony. He entered guilty pleas to 16 offenses, 3 counts of murder, 10 counts of attempted murder, and additional charges including possession of an Al-Qaeda training manual and offenses connected to ricin production. The court did not need to debate whether he did it. The question was punishment. During police interviews, he didn't break down or express shock at what he had done. He made unsolicited statements indicating he was glad he carried out the attack and had no regrets. The sentencing judge later described those remarks as deeply disturbing. They reinforced what the digital evidence had already shown. This wasn't a moment of panic or emotional collapse. It was a deliberate, settled decision to carry out mass killing. In the courtroom, he did not behave like a subdued teenager facing the consequences of his actions. At one point during proceedings, he disrupted the court to such an extent that the judge had him removed. The final sentencing remarks were delivered in his absence. That moment crystallized the gravity of the case. In sentencing, the judge imposed custody for life with a minimum term of 52 years. That means Rudakubana must serve at least 52 years before he can even be considered for release by the parole board. He was 17 at the time of the attack. The judge made something else clear. Had he been 18, the court would have been compelled to consider a whole life order, meaning never released. But UK law does not allow whole life orders for offenders under 18. The 52-year minimum was the court's way of reflecting the scale of the crime within the limits of the law. The sentence accounted for 3 child murders, 10 attempted murders, the planned acquisition of the weapon, the extremist material, the ricin-related offense. This wasn't treated as a simple stabbing case. It was treated as a mass casualty attack with ideological and premeditated elements. Public reaction across the UK was intense. Vigils were held. National media covered every detail. Parents questioned how a teenager could harbor such violent fixation for years. Politicians debated online radicalization, safeguarding, and early intervention. 3 children will never grow up. 10 others will carry the trauma of surviving, and the teenager responsible will spend the overwhelming majority of his life behind bars.
My name is Nick, and I'm going to be the next school shooter of 2018. My goal is at least 20 people with an AR-15 and a couple tracer rounds. I think I can do a good job. Location is Stone Douglas in Parkland, Florida. It's going to be a big event. And when you see me on the news, you'll all know who I am. You're all going to die.
On February 14, 2018, a 19-year-old Uber passenger was dropped off outside Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. He carried a soft rifle case. Students were texting about Valentine's Day plans. Within minutes, the building would echo with gunfire. But to understand Parkland, you don't start in Building 12. You start years earlier, inside the head of Nicholas Cruz. Cruz was born on September 24, 1998. He was adopted as a baby, along with his younger brother. His adoptive father died when he was young. His adoptive mother, Linda Cruz, raised the boys in suburban Broward County. On paper, it looked stable. In reality, Cruz was unraveling long before 2018. He struggled socially. He had explosive anger. He was described as volatile, obsessive, easily triggered. He was treated for behavioral and emotional problems. He cut himself. He lashed out at classmates. He fixated on weapons. This wasn't hidden. At school, students were uncomfortable around him. He was known for bringing up guns, known for threatening comments, known for posting disturbing material online. Teachers filed reports. Administrators disciplined him. In 2017, he was expelled from Stoneman Douglas High School for disciplinary reasons. That's a critical moment. Expulsion didn't remove the anger. It removed the structure. Now he wasn't inside the system anymore. He was outside it, watching. And he had time. Law enforcement had contact with him and his household numerous times over the years. Calls for disturbances, reports of erratic behavior. The counts vary depending on how agencies categorize them, but it wasn't a one-time encounter. It was a pattern. Online, the pattern was louder. In September 2017, a YouTube user reported a comment posted under Cruz's name saying he wanted to become a professional school shooter. That tip was forwarded to the FBI. On January 5, 2018, someone who knew Cruz personally contacted the FBI tip line with a direct warning. He had guns. He talked about killing people. He might attack a school. After the massacre, the FBI admitted that this tip should have been forwarded to the Miami field office and wasn't. Those facts matter, not as commentary, but as timeline. Because while those warnings were sitting in systems, Cruz was preparing. He legally purchased a Smith & Wesson Meters and P15, an AR-15 style rifle. He bought magazines and ammunition. He practiced. He built a fantasy into logistics. By early 2018, his life had shrunk to isolation, weapons, and resentment. On February 14, 2018, he called an Uber and headed back to the school that expelled him. He arrived around dismissal time. He entered Building 12, carrying the rifle in a bag. Then he began firing. He moved through hallways and classrooms, shooting into rooms and at students fleeing the building. The attack lasted about 6 minutes. 17 people were killed, 14 students and 3 staff members. 17 others were wounded by gunfire. Additional people were injured during the panic and escape. When it was over, Cruz didn't barricade himself. He dropped the rifle, blended into the crowd of fleeing students, walked out of campus. Surveillance footage later showed him moving through nearby businesses. He stopped at a stall. He bought a drink. He tried to look normal. He was arrested roughly 1 hour and 20 minutes after the shooting, walking in a nearby neighborhood. There was no serious doubt about identity. The evidence was immediate and overwhelming. He was charged with 17 counts of first-degree murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. But the Parkland case didn't move like a normal criminal case. It became a national symbol. Survivors organized protests. Gun laws were debated. School safety protocols were scrutinized. Inside the courtroom, however, the question narrowed to one issue: death or life. On October 20th, 2021, Nicholas Cruz pleaded guilty to all 34 counts. No trial over guilt, only a penalty phase to determine whether he would be executed. The prosecution focused on the scale and planning, the number of victims, the choice of time and place, the methodical movement through the building. The defense focused on his background, developmental issues, mental health diagnoses, and evidence that his biological mother abused alcohol and drugs during pregnancy. They presented experts who described neurological impairment and lifelong dysfunction. The jury had to be unanimous for death under Florida law at the time. On October 13, 2022, the jury found him death eligible, but 3 jurors did not vote for execution. Because the decision was not unanimous, the recommendation became life in prison without parole. The judge sentenced him to 34 consecutive life sentences, 17 life sentences for the murders, 17 life sentences for the attempted murders, consecutive, no parole, no review. He will die in prison. The outcome triggered another wave of debate. Many families were outraged that the death penalty was not imposed. In the aftermath, Florida later changed its death penalty jury threshold laws, lowering the unanimity requirement. Cruz remains incarcerated within the Florida prison system. His specific housing location is not publicly disclosed in many reports for security reasons. What is certain is the structure of his sentence, permanent. And that's where the Parkland story becomes uncomfortable. Because this case isn't just about what happened inside Building 12. It's about the years before it, the school discipline, the expulsion, the online threats, The YouTube comment, Nicholas Cruz did not appear out of thin air. He escalated in plain sight. On February 14, 2018, that escalation reached its final form. 6 minutes that ended 17 lives and permanently scarred hundreds more. On October 13, 2022, in Raleigh, North Carolina, a quiet suburban neighborhood got hit with something it was never built to handle. A teenage rampage that moved like a storm, fast, unpredictable, and impossible to forget. The shooter was 15 years old. Austin David Thompson didn't just kill strangers. He started at home by attacking his own brother, then carried the violence out into the streets, covering nearly 2 miles before the night ended with a manhunt and a shed. And years later, a judge would look at everything, the planning, the brutality, the targets, and conclude something courts rarely say about someone that young. He was irreparably corrupted. That phrase is the legal death sentence for a juvenile, because it's the finding that justifies life without parole. To people who lived in Hedingham, the setting was supposed to be safe. A residential neighborhood with walking trails, cul-de-sacs, and the kind of daytime normal that makes people feel insulated. If you asked residents before that day what danger looked like, they wouldn't have pictured a 15-year-old with weapons moving through the community. But Austin Thompson had been building something internally that didn't need a dramatic public warning to become real. The prosecution later pointed to a note found at his home, expressing hatred for humanity, words that weren't a joke or an edgy diary line, but something that framed how he saw the world. They also described an extensive internet history centered on violence and school shootings, the kind of browsing pattern that doesn't happen by accident. This is where the story becomes more chilling than a simple "he snapped." Because the picture that forms is not of a teenager having a bad day, it's of a teenager marinating in a worldview, studying violence, consuming it, and then acting it out. On October 13th, inside the Thompson home, Austin attacked his brother James Thompson, who was 16 years old. James was shot and repeatedly stabbed. After killing his brother, Austin left the house, armed with more than one weapon. Reporting describes both a shotgun and a handgun being involved in the spree. And then he went into the neighborhood. What followed wasn't confined to one building. It didn't stay behind closed doors. It unfolded outside, on streets, near homes, near a greenway area, where people were simply existing in the middle of a normal day. Over the course of the spree, 5 people were killed, 2 others were injured. Among those killed was off-duty Raleigh police officer Gabriel Torres, who was on his way to work when he was shot while in his vehicle. The other victims were neighbors, people who weren't part of a rivalry, not involved in any feud, not chosen because of something they did. They were the kind of victims that make a case feel terrifying because it suggests there wasn't a reason that could make you feel safe. It was location, timing, bad luck. As the shootings unfolded, the entire area locked down. Residents were ordered to shelter in place. Police flooded the neighborhood. Helicopters circled overhead. The city's tone shifted instantly from normal to emergency. And then came the second phase, the hunt. Austin moved through the area, and law enforcement searched for hours. The reporting describes him covering nearly 2 miles during the spree before he was finally located near the Greenway area. The manhunt stretched into the night. Eventually, he was found in a shed, and when he was taken into custody, he had a serious head wound. Later reporting described it as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He lived. That meant there would be no unresolved identity questions. He survived to face the system. But here's where people misunderstand this case. They imagine a dramatic trial. He avoided trial. In January 2026, shortly before the case was set to go before a jury, Austin Thompson pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional counts tied to the overall spree. Guilty. No debate over whether he did it. That moved the case into its most important chapter, sentencing. Because Thompson was 15 at the time, the court could not just automatically lock him away forever without doing the modern constitutional dance around juvenile sentencing. In the United States, juvenile life without parole is supposed to be reserved for the rarest cases, the ones where a judge concludes the youth is beyond rehabilitation. That's why the hearing mattered more than a typical sentencing. And this wasn't a quick afternoon in a courtroom. The sentencing hearing lasted nearly 2 weeks, packed with testimony and arguments about who Austin Thompson was, what shaped him, what he intended, and whether the law should ever declare a 15-year-old permanently beyond hope. The prosecution's story was about intent and trajectory, the note, the internet history, the scale of the spree, and the fact it began with his own brother. They framed the violence not as a single explosion, but as something with preparation and follow-through. The defense leaned hard into mitigation, arguing mental state, dissociation, and the acne medication theory, trying to build a narrative that this was not the true person, that something altered his mind and separated him from full responsibility in the way the court should consider. Then, on February 26, 2026, the judge delivered the decision Raleigh had been waiting for: life without parole. And the judge did what judges must do to legally justify that sentence for a juvenile, made the explicit finding that Thompson met the irreparable corruption standard, the rare category of juvenile offenders the court believes will not be rehabilitated. Not parole after 30 years, not review later, not maybe one day. Permanent. His attorneys announced plans to appeal the life without parole sentence. That's expected in the case this heavy, especially with a juvenile and a punishment that severe. But as it stands now, the outcome is exactly what this video title promises. That is why this sits at number 1, because most never getting out cases involve older teens, messy legal structures, or long sentences that function like life. This one is blunt. 15 years old, 5 first-degree murders, and a judge's conclusion that he will never be safe to release. From the teenager who wiped out his own family, to the one who walked into a school with a plan already made, these 10 cases represent the darkest edge of youth turned violent. They are not crimes of impulse alone, but of escalation. Warning signs ignored, obsessions fed, anger hardened into action. Their ages shocked the nation, and their stories leave a permanent scar on the communities they shattered. If you found this deep dive into these cases compelling, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which case disturbed you the most?